Hello and welcome to the Genuine Learning Blog. My name is Melissa Galasso, and today we're going to talk about something pretty special. We actually talked almost, 2 years ago about the original proposal related to IFR for NPO, and I'm excited to bring you exposure draft number 1 of 3 that we are expecting to get some feedback from you on international financial reporting. So this is proposal for international nonprofit accounting guidance. And I think this is really important because many people don't recognize this, but many countries actually don't have explicit nonprofit guidance. So while here in the United States, it's common, we have ASC section 958, and we provide a lot of guidance for not-for-profit entities. But around the world, that's not the case. And many of our nonprofits are global. And so they have a global reach. And it's just really difficult for those organizations. So back in January of 2021, there was a proposal from there was a proposal in there to look at, maybe let's start with IFRS for SMEs as a base for having more authoritative guidance for these organizations. Ultimately, starting from scratch and creating something from nothing was not the place they wanted to start. And so IFRS for SMEs really looks at the things that smaller organizations will need. And their goal, which is a pretty lofty goal, is to publish this by 2025. And so as a result, today we're going to talk about part 1, which is the International Nonprofit Accounting Guidance, or INPAG, part 1 exposure draft. And this is, we're currently basically in stage 1 of the process. So they're looking at things like the framework and the topics that they're going to prioritize. The next round of exposure draft will look into, stage 2, they'll start looking at updates and remaining topics. And then this will be something that it's ongoing, getting updated. And what's really cool about this is that this is something that's going to sit somewhere between cash basis, right? Those organizations who don't really need authoritative accrual guidance, and full IFRS or the equivalent like US GAAP. And so what we're going to talk about today is what is in this proposal and how can you help develop an international standard for not-for-profit organizations that can really make a difference. So in terms of the timeline, this is something that was issued back in the, late 2022. It was issued in Q4, and this is really part 1. And so this is the framing, the basis of the accrual accounting, talking a little bit about the types of financial statements that we're going to have, but it's not the meat to the accounting. We're going to see that later this year in Q2 of 2023 when they put out the part 2 exposure draft, which will cover mainly the accounting topics. And then even later in 2023, we're going to have the Q4 2023 proposal, and that's going to be part 3 of the exposure draft, which is going to cover presentation predominantly. And they've got some pretty lofty objectives here: quality, trust, and comparability. So when we look at the objectives, the goal is to improve the quality, transparency, and credibility of not-for-profit financial reports, right? If there's no guidance out there for many, many countries, right, then that leads to a quality issue, right? Are we giving information to users that is going to meet those quality standards? Second is that trust element, right? So if the quality is an issue, then we're going to have a trust problem. And so to support the provision of nonprofit organizations' financial information that is useful for decision-making as well as accountability, obviously given the philanthropic area here, balancing the needs of both preparers and the users. And then comparability. Again, we want to be able to compare apples to apples, right? We want to get that outcome. And so to address specific nonprofit issues, which will make things more comparable across different financial reports. So this is based on accrual accounting, right? So this is going to start there. So you're going to have a more comprehensive overview. Obviously, if you're a really small organization, you may not need that, right? Cash basis may be working great for you. But in order to improve quality and transparency, obviously accrual accounting is sort of the place that we want to go. And so that's what this is going to be based on. Again, high quality international financial reporting standards. But what I love about this, and it's something that we've talked about here in the United States that hasn't gotten very far, is the concept of non-financial information. Prior to the issuance of ASU 2016-14, the exposure draft actually floated the idea of MD&A for nonprofits, right? How do you tell your story? And this is something that we get asked about often, right? So when we're trying to tell our story and the numbers maybe aren't telling it, but we could more narratively. So this is also going to include non-financial information as part of the production of general purpose financial statements, looking at strategy, looking at risk, looking at performance in order to provide a little bit more detail. So the first thing in this proposal that they're really trying to address is the scope, right? Who should be following this? And so instead of having a finite definition, a regulatory definition, instead they decided to propose some very broad characteristics, right? So the primary objective of the organization is to provide a benefit to the public, direct financial surpluses for the benefit of the public, and that it's not a government or public sector entities that should be reporting under governmental accounting, right? So they're trying to figure out who should be within the scope of this. And again, that does require a little bit of judgment, but they're giving you the characteristics in here. Now, they could have done jurisdictional level items. They could have done, more, certain other frameworks, but they decided they weren't really created for the purpose of financial reporting. So they thought it was better to go down this more of a broad scope. And when we talk about users of the financial statements, the first user is the public who is receiving these services and goods that the nonprofit is offering. Obviously, the providers of resources are resource providers who are donating, who are providing funding, and then those who are fulfilling their oversight functions to ensure this is going well. Now, this is a very long proposal. It's not long in an overwhelming way, but it is a really nice overview of what some of the items are. So without going into all the detail, it does cover consolidation. It covers the conceptual frameworks. What are the elements of our financial statements? What are the characteristics of information? It talks about fund accounting. What are the names of the financial statements that we would be using? That narrative reporting that we talked about, a little bit more of that description, service potential, cash flows, and comparative information. And I love this. This is again from the exposure draft, right? We are in ED1. We're in that first column here. And so it's covering some of the core basic information, as well as, again, that new section, which is going to be the narrative reporting. As you can see in ED2 and ED3, we start getting into some of the actual topics. And I love the way they color coded this, because some of these are just editorial, right? Spelling differences. Trying to get things to be more consistent. Some of it is absolutely brand new, and some of them has some pretty major modifications from IFRS for SMEs. Because again, if you just think about who is the target audience here, very different than IFRS for SMEs. And so I think that you can see in the first column, which is what we're looking at today, but also what we should be expecting coming later this year. So there are actually 12 specific questions that they would love for you to ask. Each one does have some sub-questions to get feedback. And I know many of you are involved in not-for-profit organizations, and you may be like, well, we follow GAAP. This is not a big deal. I would encourage you to consider providing feedback, because I think this is such an important area. I know, for example, the FASB does have a designee on this committee to provide feedback here. And I would just love for us to be able to make a difference for these global organizations. Now, timing is not phenomenal because it is due March 31st. And I know many, many of you are knee deep in work right now, but if you can find the time, it's pretty easy to comment. You can either go to ifrfornpo.org/have-your-say, or they would accept it also via email at ifrfornpo@cipfa.org. So if you can find some time between now and the end of the month to give a little bit of feedback, I think they would love to hear it. I personally think there's some comments that could be made in the area of elements and some of the financial statement information. And I'm sure they really do want your feedback. And again, they are looking for a global reach. So if you are aware of nonprofits or you have contacts with nonprofits around the globe, please encourage them to take a look as well. So that's a wrap for this week's blog. I want to thank you guys so much for joining me, and I hope to see you on a future blog. Have a great day, guys. Bye-bye.